Watching this on video, welcome to the Kline group, and we are going to begin our time today and focus our attention on chapter 7 of God, Heaven, and Magedon, which is a really amazing chapter. But first, if you got the notes, you saw that I did a little bit of this theme here on the resurrection, and so not sure if you really got my meaning there, because I didn't put a whole lot there, but just so that you understand what I was thinking, the resurrection is such an important doctrine. The other day I was in my library and I stopped and looked around and I asked myself, how many books in my library do I have on the resurrection? I'm not talking about books that mention the resurrection, like a systematic theology or some biblical theology that has some of the resurrection in there. Guess how many books I had just on the resurrection? How many books do you guys think I have? Let's start there.
15.
I don't know.
Guess, right? Like 1,000?
Text Amy. She actually counted them all. I don't know, hundreds. Out of those hundreds of books that I have on theology, I had 0 books on the resurrection. Not one book dedicated to the resurrection. Can you think in your mind right now of one book dedicated to the topic of the resurrection? If you can, kudos to you. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I have one by Norm Geisler.
Yeah. Oh, actually, that brings up a good point. And I bet you the one by Norm Geisler is apologetics.
Yeah, Case for Christ.
Right?
Yeah.
It's going to be like Lee Strobel. It's going to be William Lane Craig, giving some defense of the resurrection. So it's always apologetics. Well, I have one now because I bought one, and the book that I bought was by Richard Gaffin on the theology of the resurrection. Why, do you guys have that one? Mm-hmm. No? But that's a good one.
I think Lane mentioned it before, right? I think I have.
I'm sure he has, because that's kind of like a classic for them, Yeah. Richard Gaffin is building on the work of Gerhardus Voss on the resurrection, but it just shows you, like, wow, the resurrection, it's like so scant, and yet it's so essential for theology. And so I thought, we'll do a little bit of a biblical theology of the resurrection. I didn't get around to it, so that's why there's no notes. So I just put up like the points that I want to study. But the need for resurrection theology is so important, because if you guys remember me saying, maybe in a sermon or maybe in another Sunday school years ago or whatever, I have mentioned this before. And what I mentioned basically was this, that if you look at the book of Acts, the central doctrinal issue for the apostles and for the early church, if you just look at the book of Acts, and I guess you can extend this out somewhat, but if you look at the book of Acts, what is the most pivotal doctrine in the early church? It is the resurrection. It is not the doctrine of justification. It is not Christology per se. It is not, predestination or election or sovereignty. It is the doctrine of the resurrection. Because for the apostles, the resurrection was the capstone to all of God's redemptive work and his activity and everything that God had spoken and revealed concerning his son. You see, so the resurrection is just absolutely essential. And also, you notice in the notes, I put the resurrection as a function of the glory spirit. So I'm trying to keep it like Kleinian and biblical theology, okay? Because a lot of people do not maybe reckon with the idea that when we're talking about resurrection, we're talking about pneumatology. So a lot of people don't make that connection. You see, they think more like, well, the resurrection is like our salvation. It's glorification. It's being raised by God, right, from the dead. It's our hope, right, and things like that. But really, in the Bible, resurrection has everything to do with the Spirit and with image endowment, the idea that the image of God in man sort of brought to its fullest expression in the Spirit. And so we always look to Christ to kind of be that pattern of, as we look at Christ in his resurrected body, who is he? What form has he taken? What is his status now? And his status as the resurrected Christ is the one who comes now in the fullness of the Spirit, so much so that 1 Corinthians actually calls Jesus the life-giving Spirit, okay? So that he becomes functionally one with the Spirit as he imparts life to his people. Just really remarkable. And then I also was thinking about, that's why it's so important to think about not only Christ's resurrection and the function of the Spirit, but the function of the Spirit in bringing his people to glory, and so the resurrection of believers and the eschaton, and just so much there to be explored. Again, I didn't have time to populate notes on this, so I just thought I'd kind of whet your appetite, and hopefully you guys can go on to study this out, and if I ever develop this, I'll bring it back eventually. But as you think about the resurrection is literally bringing believers to their consummate end, bringing believers to another age, into a new age. And so 1 Corinthians 15, I think of passages like that, verses 45 and following, where in order for you to enter into the age to come, you have to be endowed with the Spirit. You have to put on the spiritual body, for example, and things like that. And so just tremendous. If you think about the resurrection and the connection of the resurrection with the Spirit, what you're going to find in the literature, Romans chapter 8, Romans chapter 6, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, early on, and then at the end of 15, right? Constantly what you hear the authors of Scripture doing is saying that by the resurrection and by the Spirit, we have power, we have life, we have glory, right? Immortality, right? Immortality maybe being more specific, but life, glory, power, all of that is attached to the Spirit. And so the reason that becomes important is because as you start looking at glory, life, power, these things are indicative of bringing man to a new world, into a new age, into the eschaton, into heaven, into glory, all of these things. It's just remarkable. And then to realize all of this stuff is connected to the work of the Spirit in the resurrection of both Christ and of the believer. And so, I don't know. Any thoughts? Any thoughts on that? Resurrection, the Spirit? I know I didn't give you guys any notes, so you guys don't talk with my notes, but so if you have no notes, then what? But you guys see the need, right? You see the need for more theology to be done on the resurrection specifically, and so hopefully somebody will actually take the work that Gaffin has done and build upon it and give us more theology specifically on that. I've actually gone back. I've taken my notes. You guys remember the study that I did called The Spirit of Christ in Sunday school, when I was kind of connecting the work of the Spirit connected to the ministry of Christ? I've gone back and I've started to really polish my notes and stuff like that. So hopefully by next year I'll have something published. Actually, that's my hope. To put it in a book. Because that's another, you want to talk about on even another connection. I had Joseph Urban looked at, because he's got access to all the seminary databases, because once you're in seminary, I guess you got access to everyone's seminary as far as their books and stuff like that. And there again, there is no book. There's like maybe one, but it's not really focusing on like what I'm talking about, that actually explains the connection between the Spirit and Christ in the ministry of Christ. And yet, when you look at Luke chapter 1 through 4, it is the Spirit, the Spirit, the Spirit, the Spirit, all active in the life of Christ, you see? And very, very little theology actually done there. So I hope to bring that to completion. You can go back into the Sunday school if you want to hear any of those lectures that I did on that. Or classes I did on that. But, okay, so let's get to Harmagedon, the eruption of the Harmagedon conflict. What in the world is Kline talking about? Well, what Kline is talking about is that ultimately Harmagedon itself, the term Harmagedon, right, is actually a term that we meet with in Revelation 16:16. And by then, there is no question that there is a war going on, that this is, that the mountain of assembly is indicative of some kind of end time conflict. And what Kline wants to do is he wants to show us that this end time conflict does not begin in the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation 16. It actually begins from the very beginning, from the history of heaven itself. And so here's a term, guys, right? You guys that have watched Lane Tipton's stuff, you guys have heard this, but very, very few people have, okay? Very, very few people have, because if you're even thinking about biblical theology, if you're thinking about Kline's theology, you understand that we're in a very small segment of Christianity. Okay, we're a remnant within a remnant, and so very few people actually. I would venture to say this: that even if you went up to a seminarian, your average seminary student, and you asked him or her, "Explain to me the history of heaven," they'd probably look at you like, "What?" We didn't know whether there was any such history of heaven, right? Like, no one has even heard of a history of heaven. But remember what Kline is saying, what the whole book at the beginning for chapter 1 and 2, what that is telling us is that, in fact, as we look at creation below unfolding, day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to day 7 rest, right? Those days of creation are mirroring something in the upper register, namely the creation of the heaven of heavens, the highest heaven, the presently veiled heavens. And when that heaven began, it began to unfold in a heavenly history. And that heavenly history hit a point where conflict arose and Satan was cast out of heaven. So right there we see that there was, I guess we could even say, an angelic heaven that was angelic history that was unfolding in the heavenly places. And that angelic history showed that heaven had some sort of interruption, and that the Sabbath was a picture of the consummation, but that consummation still needs to be fulfilled. That's where Adam comes in. Adam comes in as the one who has the ability to consummate heaven, to bring it to its intended goal. But he does not do that. And so what this whole book is all about really is to remind us that the one who consummates the history of heaven is the one who consummates the history of earth, which is Jesus Christ, through the resurrection, if we go back to the resurrection theme, you see. So through the resurrection of Christ, and then eventually through the glorification of his people, the history of heaven itself is consummated. So this conflict of Armageddon goes all the way back. All the way back. So that's what we're going to look at chapter 7. It's going to be a big one. Now, here's something. If you have your book, take your book real quick and turn with me, because I want to suggest something. I want to prepare you guys for something, okay? If you look at the section that we're not going to cover today, Covenant and Armageddon Conflict, page 65, okay? What Kline does there is he gives an interpretation of Ezekiel 28. Now, here's the thing. I think other interpreters are right, and I think Kline gets this one wrong. Kline wants to define Ezekiel 28 as indicative of the fall of Satan, okay? But a real case can be made, and it's probably the one that I'm going to make, is that Ezekiel 28 is actually more talking about the fall of Adam, not Satan. Okay, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So I'll just prepare you to think that way. There is a lecture that Lane Tipton did. Maybe if you guys reach out to me, I'll send it to you, where he gives arguments of why he disagrees with it, and they're very convincing arguments. And so probably what I'll do is I'll bring those arguments here, and so that we can work through them, okay? But it's the reason I mention that is because that's a major portion of chapter 7, and we're going to take issue with that. We're at least going to interact with that. What is difficult is, could it be both? Could it be that the ultimate architectonic, to use Kline's work, right? The original that sets in motion all the typology, that it's really the fall of Satan, and then that Adam is sort of like becomes like Satan in his fall. You see, it's possible, but there's reasons to suggest that it's not.
That's what I thought
Yeah.
we're expecting Kline's position to be, because earlier he kind of leaves that sort of undetermined. He kind of says it could be either Adam or Satan, right? I think
Mhm.
earlier in chapter 5 or 6, he says it could be either one. So for him to take like a hard line stance is kind of interesting here.
Yeah, that's right. So what he wants to do is he wants to situate the conflict of Armageddon in heaven, to show the beginning of it, the origins of it. Okay, that's really his thing. So, but as we begin, he doesn't really give us any words here at the beginning of chapter 7. And so what I did is kind of just try to summarize, as we look ahead, summarize some of this for us. And so this is what just the opening of the chapter, this is what I wrote. I said, based on the previous chapters, we see the final significance of the Sabbath already intimated to mean something more than simply a creation ordinance. Now, see, this is why it's so important to read somebody like Kline and to study biblical theology, because now we're starting to see the limitations of of systematic theology. Because typically, if you think about the Sabbath as a topic, right? Here's what happens. Here's what happens under systematic theology. Okay, under systematic theology, you have a subject like the Sabbath. Okay, and then in that subject, what you do is you take all the books of the Bible. Let's say these are the books of the Bible. Okay, from Genesis to Revelation, and then you take the relevant texts and you take those texts to support, the topic, right? But what happens is then you tear those texts out of their context. Because where do these texts belong? In the book, those texts are coming like this, okay? In other words, here's the text, but the text is connected to what went before it and what goes after it, okay? But when you take it out of its context just to support a topic, you lose the linear thought of Scripture, okay? So this is the difference. This is one of the differences between biblical theology and systematic theology. It's so important. When you see this, you kind of see, oh wow, like theology suddenly becomes multidimensional, right? Instead of just like pick a topic and just give a bunch of proof text to that topic, suddenly you see, wait. That text has its own meaning in a sense, right? Not that it can't support the subject of the Sabbath or justification or whatever, okay, the resurrection. But the question is what does that text mean within its own context? And what you end up finding is that, unlike systematic theology, biblical theology belongs to the realm of what? It belongs to the realm of history. That's what it belongs to. Systematic theology is not historically sensitive. Okay, but biblical theology is. Biblical theology is all about how does this passage fit within the story, the unfolding meta-narrative of Scripture. You see what I'm saying? So it becomes very important to see that. So when we think of it this way, the Sabbath already indicates a lot more than just what's a creation ordinance. You see? More than just, it's a sign of the covenant, Moses. More than, it's a principle of worship, or it's ecclesiology. Now, from the biblical theology angle, what we're asking is, how does the Sabbath function in the text of Genesis? Furthermore, how does the Sabbath function in the unfolding of the story of redemption? What's the purpose of the Sabbath in the overall teaching of the Bible? That's the question that we need to ask. And when we begin to ask those kinds of questions, because you can say, well, the Sabbath is, a creation ordinance, or, and we can take, let's say Exodus 31, verse 17, where it's called a sign of the covenant, right? And we can deduce, well, the Sabbath is a sign. But does Exodus chapter 31, verse 17 tell you really what the purpose of the Sabbath is? No, it does not. No, it does not. The only way you will know what the purpose of the Sabbath is if you situate it along, if you took the books of the Bible, again, linearly, right? And you have all the books, right? It's not until you understand how does it function as the Sabbath goes through the Bible. See, that's important. Yeah, any questions? You just look at you have something right at the edge of your
I'm just
chest.
curious, like,
Yeah.
when you say that biblical theology in some sense, like, supersedes systematic theology, like, should one become a strong student first of biblical theology?
Both. Both. And that's the danger. The danger is that biblical theology, and this is what systematics departments will even fear, is that biblical theology might make people feel as if biblical theology is superior, therefore we can leave off our systematics. I say no, you can't leave off systematic theology either. But it's kind of like the handmaid of systematic theology. In order to have the fullest, richest systematic theology, you need to have the biblical theology. In order to have the best biblical theology, you had better have a good systematic theology. You see what I'm saying? Because you never want to engage in the art of biblical theology without those orthodox foundations, to those grounding principles of Christian theology and Reformed theology to kind of ground you while you're making your work and you're making your insights and all that stuff. You know what I mean? So it is that's why some would say, there was a Reformation in in Christendom and through Luther and the Reformers, right? And then there was another Reformation with Voss in biblical theology when he wrote the biblical theology. There was another Reformation, as it were. There was another sort of Copernican moment when everything shifted. You see, and some would say, like me. I'm someone, right? So some would say there was another revolution, if you would, another Reformation in apologetics with Van Til. And actually, people have said that. What's that guy's name? James Anderson, I think is his name. Not to be confused with the other Anderson, the wacko, the guy that you guys encountered, right? Not that dude, but
Not Steve.
Yeah. I won't even utter his name. But you see, so that's why I'm saying, more than just a creation ordinance, more than the sign of the Mosaic covenant, more than just a principle of worship, in the final analysis, the Sabbath is programmatic of the eschaton. See, you're not going to get that from one text of the Bible. It's not until you take all the relevant texts and synthesize those texts, right? Which ironically is exactly what Hebrews chapter 4 does. It takes the history of Israel, it takes the history of special revelation, right? And then synthesizes that whole history together. What happened to the Israelites under Joshua, right? Then becomes important to what happened in Genesis 2 on the seventh day. That's incredible. And so the author of Hebrews takes what happens under Joshua and what happened in Genesis 2, puts them together to give us the function of the Sabbath and what the purpose of the Sabbath really is, which we're going to interact with that because Hebrews 4, again, it lays out the deepest biblical theology regarding the eschatological nature of the Sabbath, namely that the rest of the original seventh day was laying before man, listen now carefully, it was laying before man now a potential procurement. What does that mean? Well, Brother Dylan was scolding me, like I'm like Kline's scapegoat or something.
Scolding you for what?
For the difficult terms that Kline, he said, you know how many words I had to look up on Google, this week? To me, it's like, well, that's how you grow, You got to have, I remember when I first started studying theology, the book that never left my desk was a dictionary because I didn't understand any of these words, And so, procurement just means the obtainment, right, of the eschatological advancement in the Spirit. So this is me summing up, okay? Summing up that what the Sabbath was setting in motion, what the Sabbath was setting in front of man was this potential to advance in the Spirit eschatologically where? In the supernal realm, the heavenly realm, beyond the veil, to use the language of Hebrews, right? In the upper register, in the glory realm. That is what the Sabbath was setting in front of man. It was that. In order to bind God and man to this eschatological program, a covenant bond was necessary and found expression in the covenant of works. That's beautiful, because to me, it's like this is not God just randomly doing stuff. Like the Sabbath, well, that's a good, that could work. You know what I mean? Like, no. It's covenantally bound. You see what I'm saying? That I like that, because God is a covenant God. We are covenant creatures. This is a covenant world that we live in. No matter what the dispensationalists say, it is covenantal through and through. Okay, and so that's kind of my opening thought there. Any questions? And before we get to Sabbath, eschatology, and covenant, any questions regarding the chapter as a whole? Maybe if you have any questions that came up, I don't want to lose sight of that. I always said bring your questions beginning of the class. We'll handle some of those questions. But anything that perked your interest that you need to talk about, that's the thing with Kline. It's like you got to get it. If you don't get it, don't move on.
I think it's in the section
Yeah.
we're not going to go over, but Kline talks about in page 67, the second paragraph, how basically when God made man is what made Satan jealous.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I didn't see where he got that. Like I didn't like he quoted Genesis 1:26, but when I read that, I don't see anything he's saying. I don't see what he's saying in that. How he knows that, I guess.
Well, he says, recorded in Genesis 1:26 is the particular development in the history of heaven and earth that was, it would appear, the catalyst for the emergence of the lust for deity in the heart of the anointed cherub, blameless in his ways from the day that he was created. So yeah, what he's saying is that when Satan saw that man was endowed with the image of God, that is what caused him to become antagonistic towards man. To see that by placing the image of God in man immediately became the benefactor of all of God's glory and all of his kingdom and all of his, the things that were promised to him. And so, Satan started figuring it out, what God was getting ready to do by creating this earthling to inherit the kingdom. And so I think you could start stringing together even in the temptation of Adam 2, right? That what Satan wants to do is get Adam 2 not to inherit the kingdom of God, but instead to try to deceive him and present to him an alternative kingdom to inherit an alternative glory or something like that. So I think there's maybe something to that. That's a good question though, Brandon. Huh?
Do scholars agree on that? Is that pretty...
For what?
That position that, Satan grew jealous or envious of humanity for being endowed.
I don't think so. I think you'd be hard pressed to find scholars even talk about that point, you know what I mean? Which is a shame. And it could, this could lend to what I've said before, Jai, that the problem with the Genesis text and the way that scholarship has handled it up to this point is in two ways. Either they handle it apologetics wise, right? And that's why I came up with my favorite dictum, right? Genesis is about Christ, not Darwin, because you would think from the literature that Genesis is written for Darwin, for crying out loud, right? Everything is always about evolution and the dating of the earth and all of that. Or if you go to the critical commentaries, you go to critical scholarship, they're usually tackling Genesis from a literary standpoint, trying to understand Genesis as literature, authorship, prose, what is the structure of the text, its literary milieu, how does it stack up against ancient literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and whatever, all that stuff. How does that all go together? You know what I mean? That's their main concern, is Genesis as a piece of literature. And then the theologians, typically, they access Genesis systematic theology. They see it more systematically. Well, it introduces themes like, being created in God's image. Well, what does that mean? And they try to define the image instead of trying to figure out, in the true theology of the Bible, the unfolding of the history of the Bible, what is the image of God? What is the Sabbath? You see what I'm saying? What does it mean for man to tend the garden? All of these things that they don't seek to answer. They don't seek to answer. And so it is unique, I think, for Kline to make some of these connections. But I think the more you ponder, I've often said about Meredith Kline that a lot of times you'll encounter this, and you tell me if you've already encountered this, but you'll encounter something that he says, and you're like, I don't know about that. You'll put a question mark, like, wow. I've got question marks in the book of Kline, like, what? And then later, as you're studying on, Beale, or maybe you might be off in some commentary or something, you're like, wait a minute, that's what Kline was talking about. You see what I'm saying? So a lot of times you'll find like, wow, there's justification of what he's talking about. You'll find it later on somewhere. The notorious problem with people like Kline and Voss and Van Til, I've said this before, they just assume that people kind of were on the level tracking with you, on these thoughts, and we're not. Nobody's on the level. Even their seminary students would be like, we're not on the level. You got to explain it to us, But sometimes they don't. They just don't. They just kind of assume you're tracking. And so it's just like this endless stream of consciousness sometimes, But he does give, like he says, a satanic hubris, the pride of Satan, will then have been a jealous reaction to God's plan to create man, the image son of the Most High, an Elohim being like the angels. And so why does he say that an Elohim being? Well, because in places like Psalm 8, God has created man a little lower than the angels, Psalm 82. What's Psalm 82? Is that you are gods or something like that?
I think it is, yeah.
Is that? Psalm 82. Huh?
Yeah, it said that you're God.
Yeah. So basically, the fact that man is like God in many ways, he becomes an Elohim creature himself, belonging to the, suitable for the heavenly realm. Basically, it's what it's all about. To grant him dominion over all the works of his hands. That's right, because, and that's what the psalmists everywhere talk about. Like that you have put man over the works of your hands. So this delegated dominion, and if there's anything that Satan wants is dominion, and so now he sees that God is giving man dominion. Genesis 1:26, right? What's he given? Dominion, and so Satan sees that, and he doesn't like it. And so he wants to come in right at that critical moment and disrupt, you see, that whole covenantal arrangement that is unfolding before him. So something like that. So, anything else?
It's in the same paragraph, but he mentioned it before. I listened to one of the previous classes. I think you said you don't agree with this, but I might have heard you wrong. But where he mentions that, Genesis when it says, let us make man in our image, and he's saying that the us is the angelic council as well.
Yes.
Which to me sounds, when I hear that, it sounds like he's saying that we're made in the image of God and angels.
Right. That's his position.
Okay.
His position is that because the angels, they are sort of in the heavenly council,
Right.
that's who he would be addressing, is those that were in the royal court, so to speak, of heaven, and that the angels, because they are called Elohim themselves, that they somehow partake of the image of God. So that's a very we talked about that from the outset. It's controversial for him to make that statement. I'm not convinced, and so I don't go there. I think only man is made in the image of God, and until I see clear proof of that, like Lane Tipton says, I wouldn't want to debate Kline on that, but until I'm totally convinced, like as someone that has to teach in Sunday school in the church, I'm not prepared to unleash the image of God in angels. You know what I'm saying? And go against 2,000 years of church history that pretty much, summarily suggests that only man is in the image of God. So anyway, that's my position. But any other questions? Anything that we might need to handle before we go any further, or what? No? Nothing? You sure? Nothing too small?
I have a lot of questions. We won't get anywhere.
We won't get anywhere?
Yeah.
Well, we might need your questions, though. If you think they're relevant to what we're talking about, will you go ahead and raise them?
Yeah.
We would appreciate that.
has, I mean, it's another one's in the same chapter, you might
Yeah.
go over it, but I
Yeah.
don't have to do the Sabbath, obviously, but he talks about, I actually think it's in chapter before, he talks about how basically the consummation was predestined. He says,
Where at?
this is page 19, this is way back in the day, but I know it has to do with the Sabbath, because later on he mentions the Sabbath in that, but he's talking about how, he just says that the consummation is predestined, I just didn't understand. He says, for the special creation of Adam and Eve, the contention is contradicted by the biblical disclosures concerning the eschatological structure of creation history, and particularly the predestined consummation of the created order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I know, like, later on he connects that to the Sabbath, I believe, in this chapter is what he's saying, but
So what's the question?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't get how he's saying that contradicts the predestined consummation of the created order.
Okay, let me see here. Let me read this here. Page 19 at the top of the book says, quite apart from the evidence in Genesis 2:7, 21, and 22 for the special creation of Adam and Eve, that contention is contradicted by the biblical disclosures concerning the eschatological structure of creation history. In particular, let's see here. In particular, hold on a second here.
I think.
He's combating the notion of evolution.
Okay.
Yeah, and the idea that man sort of
Apart
evolved.
from God.
Yeah, and sort of abrupt to the purpose of God, you know. He's saying no, it's not a random act of evolution of any kind, you know. This is all in keeping with God's created, predestined, you know, plan, something like that, you know.
Okay, that helps.
I think that's kind of what, definitely he's trying to refute evolution and stuff like that. Yeah, that's a lot there. Okay, let's try to make some progress here because my notes are real short tonight, and I'm thinking, great, I'll be able to finish. That would be an accomplishment, right? Never happens. Cato's like, we never get anywhere. Yeah, and somehow we get a lot done, don't we? Okay, Sabbath, eschatology, and covenant. Wow, think of that, guys. So aside from the practical controversy surrounding the Sabbath observance in the New Covenant Church, from the Sabbath itself, what is to be learned is the archetypal rest of God, consisting in his total glory enthronement. That's right. So, see, that is so important because the way we've learned Genesis so oftentimes, we just don't understand that what is being given to us there in Genesis is a pattern. It's a pattern of God's enthronement and as the sovereign of the cosmic temple, as Kline talks about so many times. It's not just that we go to the Sabbath, again, for these sort of typical historical debates. I guess it's capable of that, but that's not really the function of it in Genesis. The function is to show us exactly what God is doing and what is potential for man. Again, Kline says the history of creation has a sabbatical form. Here, Kline is referring to the creation week consisting of work and rest. Later, page 63, to be described more fully as work, judgment, rest. And again, where does he get the notion of judgment? You guys remember? Why does he say work, judgment, rest?
Well, he judges
his creation.
Right.
He judges his creation, and at that point, Kline is careful to point out it is not a judgment for any sort of moral quality, right? It's not a judgment of right or wrong creation, but still, it is a judgment that is assessing the work, just like God is going to assess the work of man, right? He assesses his own work and renders the appropriate conclusion to that, being good and then ultimately very good. And so from the Sabbath, we are to meet both. Here we go, guys. Here we're functioning now within the Kline ecosystem here, right? With the Sabbath, this is what's important. We meet both the alpha radiation, right, the beginning. So alpha radiation, and maybe even more importantly, God as alpha, right? With that attribute, he is the beginning of it all. Right? And then what does the Sabbath do? It provides us with a notion of God that he's also Omega. It's kind of interesting, right? Because let's think about the title, Alpha and Omega. Does God have a beginning? No. Does God have an end? So in what way are we saying that he is Alpha and Omega? If he has no beginning, if he has no end, right? And so that if you start thinking in that way, God has no beginning, God has no end. So the Alpha cannot be talking about God's beginning. He has no beginning, right? But something like the idea that God is the beginner. You see? He is the architect. He is the one who begins the creation. It's interesting, right? And he is also the consummator. He is Omega. So Alpha, James White would be very proud right now. He is Alpha and Omega, He is the Omega apocalypse, right? The Omega consummator, so to speak. And so that's what the Sabbath does. It's a beautiful picture that what God did is he taught man, he taught him something. Even in creating, he was already teaching, laying out a pattern. And it reminds me, almost like God is in the business of doing this, because who else did he give a pattern to? Moses. Where?
The tabernacle.
He gave him a pattern of the tabernacle on the mountain, and that tabernacle was supposedly patterned after a better tabernacle, or an original tabernacle. Book of Hebrews says the heavenly one, which is amazing. And then it even says heaven itself. Wow, that's above my pay grade. So, I can understand a heavenly, and then it says heaven itself. It's like, wow, it's crazy. So it must be that the earthly pattern corresponding to the heavenly pattern, right, was ultimately just a small little microcosm, what Kline often calls a projection of something far greater that really has more to do with reality and less to do with like a one-to-one correspondence. You know what I'm saying? It's like, in other words, when we get to heaven, don't expect to go through like a giant veil or something. Like there is going to be like giant rings and poles of a giant tabernacle. That's not the dynamic. It's not so much a one-to-one physical correspondence. It's a one-to-one correspondence, ideally, I guess we could say, idealistic, right? Corresponding to some reality that the tabernacle was meant to teach us about, namely the presence of God or something like that. It's just remarkable. But again, that's what God is doing in the creation week. And so by sabbatical rest, man was to perceive the God of the eschaton. So when God rested, he was already setting in front of him a God who consummates, so that Adam was to see my life moves toward consummation. My whole existence is to be consummated one day. You see what I'm saying? It's so beautiful. Again, this would give man both a telos, which is like a goal, purpose, a design, of purpose. In other words, here in the sabbatical structure, man found the purpose of his existence, to obtain heavenly rest, right? To obtain the rest of God. Why does he say the rest of God? Because in Hebrews and other places, right? What does he say? They will not enter my rest. It is God's rest, ultimately, right? And not only that, but he also gives them the goal on a cosmic scale. That what God did, he did on a cosmic scale. And so not only purpose for Adam, but purpose for the whole cosmos. Not only is Adam to reach his consummate end, but the whole cosmos would reach some sort of consummation that we now know as new heavens, new earth. So all that from the first original creation week, yes. And that's what's incredible about it. Any questions, comments, feedback? Nothing. I don't want to be the only one talking all the time, but I will if I must. Yeah, it's good, right? Yeah.
To sit back and hear this and just think, man is to be like God, and you see like what that entails. Like, just Adam, as soon as he was created, like you're saying, just knew that's my goal, to be like my God, to be like my King. It's interesting to just think about, like, he already knew that, like, once he came in, he knew his purpose. It's kind of what we're talking about.
Right.
His end.
Yes, that's good. That's a good point. Let's see, where do we leave off? The purpose was to live in line with God under the rubric of work and rest. But finally, and at the deepest level, The goal to be reached was one of rest unknown in the meta world, even as Hebrews suggests. Now, you guys remember what Kline was talking about when he mentioned the meta world, right? The world beyond, right? Beyond human kin, in other words, beyond perception, the presently veiled world. That's what lied ahead of Adam. Notice the structure of the theology of Hebrews. Because I cited Hebrews. Now, let's turn there. Turn in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 4 again, because I noticed something in the text of Hebrews that might throw you off. Might throw you off at first, right? You guys, look at Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. And try to discern, I guess, exegetically. Verse 14 begins with what conjunction there? Therefore, right? And you've heard preachers say this from the pulpit. Therefore, we need to figure out why therefore is therefore, whatever it is. Okay. What is therefore? What is that word therefore? He says, therefore, since we have a great high priest. Now, go back to verses 1 through 13 and find for me the reference to Jesus as our high priest. Silence is deafening. You're not going to find it. Right? So it's almost like, what? In other words, guys, it seems abrupt. How do we go from what you were talking about with the Sabbath, that's what it's all been all about so far, to, therefore, the high priest? Where did the high priest come from?
I forgot you had to write chapter 5 about the high priest. So you're by the way, Jesus is a high priest.
Yeah.
So I can talk
But that's chapter 5, right? But here the author of Hebrews is saying, therefore the high priest X, Y, and Z. What? I don't understand. Where is the logic of the high priest so far? Therefore, I was supposed to conclude this? And then he says, therefore, the high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. And then he goes on to talk about, that he's a sympathetic high priest. We can come to him, the mercy, the throne of grace, all of that. Now look up at the screen here because I kind of laid it out a little bit. This is how the text is laid out, right? The proposition, verses 1 through 8, is laid out regarding Joshua and rest, okay? And then we go into a parentheses, verses 12 to 13, right? We know that passage. What does it say? For the word, was it 12? Yeah, 12, 13. The word of God is living and active, sharper than a two-edged sword, right? Dividing through the division of, what does it say? Piercing as far as, division of soul and spirit, joint, marrow, right? Blah, blah, blah. And then verse 14 to 16, there resumes the thought. So we go from the parentheses back to the thought. So it's resumptive. And so what I'm suggesting is this. As this thought resumes, I want to read it to get it right. High priest fits the pattern. How? Having accomplished his work, redemption as the true Joshua, that's who Jesus is, then he moves into true Sabbath rest by virtue of his eschatological advancement as he passes through the heavens. Okay, passing through the heavens is then the notion of the veil, right? Represented by the notion of the veil going through the heavens. We talked about that before. Everybody with me there? Everybody tracking there, right? If that's what that's talking about in tabernacle parlance and stuff like that, to go through the veil in the tabernacle was indicative of passing through the heavens, okay, and into the holy place. You see? Anyway, I don't want to take us too far off. So Jesus, therefore, then becomes, watch this now, a sabbatical forerunner for all of God's people. And that is found in chapter 4, verse 20, right? He's our forerunner. He goes before us. He's gone through the veil. Actually, wait, 20? No, that's wrong. 6:20. Oh, I'm glad I caught that. I'll have to fix that later. Can I actually edit that from here? Yeah, I can. Sorry. It's 6:20. What does 6:20 says? Is where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And so, the text in Hebrews Joshua, interestingly enough, the literal Greek is Jesus, Yesu. It's interesting. Occupies the role of a priest. How? In giving rest to the people of God. See that? Even says that. The Greek word means he causes them to rest. That's remarkable. Now, this is important. So thus, when it resumes in verse 14, it's not out of place. It's not abrupt in bringing in the language of high priest, because this is the typical function of Joshua. You guys all get that? This was the typological function of Joshua in what? I got to highlight more. In bringing the people to Canaan. In bringing his people to Canaan, Joshua is functioning like the ultimate high priest who brings his people into Sabbath rest. Okay? And so Jesus is following Joshua's priestly pattern. Therefore, he's considered the high priest. That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. So, what does he bring them into? He brings them into the typological land. It's important. Okay, so I give a little bit of hermeneutics, guys. You guys with me? Look at what it says here. Okay, look what I said here. I forget sometimes. I'm reading my own notes. It's important to point this out. The typology here is not utilized by the author of Hebrews. Watch this carefully. This is a huge distinction that a lot of people simply don't get and will not allow. Okay, this becomes real important for hermeneutics. So the author of Hebrews is not rereading Scripture. Okay, the author of Hebrews as a rereading of Hebrews, but as a per se reading. And actually, no, that's wrong. It's not a rereading of Hebrews. Let me just put this here. Rereading of the Old Testament. But as the per se reading, that is the inherent original typological function of the Old Testament text. You guys know what I'm saying there? What am I saying there, K-Dub? Can you please help me? What am I saying there?
It's not a verbatim quote, but he's telling you what it means, not what it just says.
No. What do you think I mean there? Think about that very carefully, guys. The author, this is what we're saying.
So he's not merely representing the same story, but it's
no, there we go. We're hung up. And we're hung up on the word rereading. I should have defined that. The word rereading actually is kind of a technical way of talking. When scholars speak of a rereading of the Old Testament text, it's what they're saying is they're doing a revision to it. They're revising the original text to read something else now. See what I'm saying? It's not so the author of Hebrews is not, in a sense, he's not recasting it in a different way. He's not saying the Old Testament texts that we're looking at with Joshua and today if you hear his voice, all those Old Testament allusions and citations, this is not the author of Hebrews revising the OT and making it mean something new. That's the issue. So I'll have to clarify my notes, but instead, what is this, guys? Instead, it's not a rereading of the text in that way. This is a per se reading. What does per se mean? The word per se just literally means of itself, meaning inherent, original, meaning it is the original Old Testament meaning of the text. Because what the author of Hebrews is now telling us is that what the OT text meant originally through typology was this, that Joshua was functioning as a priest for the people of God to bring them into eternal Sabbath rest. That was his typology. Kind of like the Exodus, you know what I mean? Like the Exodus was originally typological of God bringing his son out of Egypt. So when Matthew reads that, Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, he's not rereading the Old Testament in a different liberal way. Okay, this is liberal hermeneutics. The liberals accuse the New Testament authors. If you don't know this, you need to know this. The liberals accuse New Testament authors of recasting the Old Testament, rereading it, filling it with a foreign apostolic meaning that's not originally part of the Old Testament text. But what Hebrews is giving us here is saying, no, 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 no. The typological inherent meaning of the original Old Testament passages is teaching us this very reality that I'm presenting before you now. Jesus as high priest for his people to bring them to everlasting rest. The rest that Joshua failed to do. Look at verse 8. If Joshua had given them rest, so he did not, he would not have spoken of another day after that. And so Joshua, from the mere typological, kind of like the high priests, right? It's kind of like what he's going to say later on in the book of Hebrews, right? Like if the high priest would have presented a sacrifice that would have been once for all, there'd be no need for another sacrifice, you know what I'm saying? But they have been sacrificing from the foundation, like over and over and over to show that there's another sacrifice that awaits, you see? It's kind of like the same thing. It's like we need another Joshua. And Jesus is that Joshua, you see? And so that's what's going on there. And so Jesus as the ultimate high priest, he brings us to final rest in the true Canaan by passing through the heavens for us. And that's correlated, and that's made very plain. Look at Hebrews 11, and we'll take a little break because we've been going pretty hard here. Hebrews 11, verses 13 to 16. Somebody want to read that? Wally, can you read that very loud, verses 13 to 16?
Hebrews 11:13.
Yeah.
All these died in faith without having received the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had an opportunity to return.
Verse 16.
Oh. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
That to me is the ultimate liberal killer right there, right? Because what the author of Hebrews just said was, when the Old Testament patriarchs and saints spoke of this country and desiring this country, they weren't talking about their old homelands. They were talking about a heavenly city. Right? Because he said if they were, they had opportunity to go back. Abraham could have just moved back. No. They were actually seeking the meta world. And they knew it to some degree, to some extent. They understood that they were on this eschatological trajectory towards the city of God. Right? What? Like maybe they wouldn't have used the language of Hebrews, okay? Like maybe they couldn't have such mature language. But they definitely, the truth of what they were seeking is organically one and the same as ours. And that's what Hebrews, that's where he's going to go, right? Doesn't he conclude that way? Right? Verse 39. All these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised because God had provided something better for us. Watch this now. So that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. In other words, this all awaited a time when all of God's people together, you see, would have the perfection of the consummation of what was promised, you see. So that's why they didn't receive the goal at that time. Yeah, okay, let's take a little bit of a break since we've gone kind of hard and heavy here. And let me end it with this. Let me end it with this sentence, because then I can end it with this paragraph. Let me just end it with this for the record. As our sympathetic high priest, Jesus is the one who understands our world wilderness experience. He imparts to us grace to endure in exile until at last we arrive at our own godlike rest, man's archetypal purpose. There it is. So with that, let's take a little bit break, and then I will make sure to pause this. And so for those of you on Ecamm Live, we'll take a little break and Good. Okay, we're back, and let's dive right back in here. Let me pull up these notes. Very cool. All right, so let's just finish what I was saying here. Just in terms of the original design of the Sabbath structure of creation and what that means for man. So then, this original design for man that is being set forth for the first Adam upon his successful probation under the creation covenant. Again, it's like this is going to lead into everything I'm talking about in terms of why covenant is so important to Kline and dealing with his justice system and all of that. But all of this, again, tells us that from the outset, the creation, both the upper and lower register, uppermost in the divine program has been the eschatological, not the redemptive. That's so important because it reminds us that in theology, the eschatological precedes the redemptive, and in a sense has the priority, the primacy, right? It's all eschatological, and what we'll learn later, hopefully, is that biblical eschatology is really the realm of pneumatology. And so that introduces a whole new way to think, right? That when we think about eschatology, we're really thinking about the realm of the Spirit now, okay? Because it is by the Spirit that man will be advanced into his eschatological state. Okay, so it's a real interesting way that theology really goes together. Not surprising if you have Herman Bavinck's 4 volumes. You guys have that? Anybody have that yet? No? Got to have that. Got to get that. You need those 4 volumes by Bavinck. It's like got to be on the shelf. His volume on eschatology, he actually puts the doctrine of the Spirit next to that. So he's one of the few theologians that understood that when you're in the realm of eschatology, you have to be talking about pneumatology almost simultaneously. It's got to go together, you know. So anyway, this is what Kline says about that. He says, God's sabbatically structured reign is one of movement to cosmic consummation. And since man's activity is patterned after his creators, human history has, like its divine archetype, its original, a sabbatical structure. From the outset, mankind has been on the way toward a predestined eternal Sabbath. Informed by this consummation-directed dynamic, man's history has from the beginning an eschatological character. So there you go. From the very beginning, man has been on the path to this sort of eschatological consummation. And that's what, one of the things that eventually I'll have to develop a little bit better. We did this a little bit, and we'll do this when we talk about Ezekiel 28 to some degree. But turn to Matthew 28. You guys remember a few weeks ago I did a sermon on the Great Commission? You guys were paying attention. I did a little bit of Magedon theology there at the beginning. You guys saw that? My client, I was gunning for the Kline group. I was like, I know who's with me. Verse 16, you remember the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee. Where? To the mountain which Jesus had designated. And so it's interesting that here you have Adam 2. And when it comes to his full dominion disclosure, all authority given to me, right? That full dominion disclosure there, where does it take place? On the mountain, right? And even, now turn to Luke chapter 1. Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1. Beginning of verse 12. The upper room, remember? Beginning of verse 12. Then they returned to Jerusalem from where? From the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives. I have a beautiful picture from the Mount of Olives when we went to Israel. Do you remember where the Mount of Olives is at? It's like when you're up on the mount, you're looking down at 2 cemeteries. The first one is Jewish. The second one, as you're going up towards the Temple Mount, is Palestinian. And
Right beside that was the path.
and then, well, yes, beside that, that's the Via Dolorosa, and then in the middle of that is the Kidron Valley. right? And so, Kidron, if you go east of the Kidron Valley, you go to the Mount of Olives. If you keep going on the Mount of Olives, you go over the ridge of the Mount of Olives, you're over facing Bethany. And that's probably where Jesus was, because, what does it say here? It was what? Near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. So that meant it was far away. It was far enough away that on the Sabbath, it would take the limitations of a Sabbath journey, which you were only allowed to travel so far on the Sabbath, to get there. So it's not that far, right? It's like 2,000 cubits, the commentators say. And from there, from that mountain region, he ascends into heaven. So again, what I'm saying is that, to me, these are Adamic ideas. This is Adam 2, who has now been given all authority and dominion, who comes with full, in the full power of the Spirit endowment. From the text in Acts, how do we know that for certain? Because it is in that very context that he's going to pour forth the Spirit upon his church, right? So there's Adam 2 with all the fullness of the Spirit ascending into heaven from the mountain of God, showing that from the mountain of God is the portal between heaven and earth. So whatever Adam was doing on the mountain, Ezekiel chapter 28, well, that already shows you my view, right? I'm more in the Adamic side, right? Like Lane Tipton teaches. That it's Adam on the mountain in Eden, and what Adam is doing on that mountain in Eden is showing that for him to go from earth to heaven, that is a mountain ascension. That is ascending the hill of the Lord, and that act is like a reenactment of what it means to go from this earth into the heavens, into the new heavens, into the new earth, as it were, right, into another realm. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing here. He is he's ascending the mountain of God, and then he is going through the heavens into the upper register. Kind of like what Adam was typifying, Jesus did it. You see what I'm saying? And it's just remarkable. And then in Ezekiel, here, go to Ezekiel 28 again, just since we're already blowing it. We're already there. But you remember what, if the Adamic position is correct, then all of these precious stones, what does it say there? You were covered in all these precious stones, verse 13, right? Ezekiel 28, verse 13, you were in Eden. So that limits our interpretation. Who was in Eden? Well, Adam and Eve and the serpent. And so one of those three is the one. And it's definitely not Eve, because he is being likened to a man here, to the king of Tyre. So it's got to be either the serpent or it's got to be Adam. And if it's Adam, what is the purpose of all the beauty of Eden? Well, the purpose of all of that was, the glory of God to some degree, and some would say that the beauty of all of this is image endowment, is that these precious stones are reminiscent of being clothed with the glory of God, and that glory is ultimately seen where and when we take on the image of Christ, right? Refracted in us. And so, two passages, and just stop me, please, and I'll go as slow as you want here, because we're in very, very crucial territory here. But 2 Corinthians chapter 4, I'm just thinking of these. Also, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17 to, 18. And here, no, let me do this. Turn there. Let's turn there. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 first. Right? There we go. What is the new covenant? What is the new covenant? The new covenant is called the ministry of what? 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 10. I've written it here. Right? What does it say here? Indeed, what had glory, in this case, has no glory. Why? Because of the glory that surpasses it. And there, what is he comparing it to? What glory is he comparing it to? It's interesting dynamic because notice what he's saying. Look, go back to verse 7. He says, if the ministry of death, that's the old covenant, in letters engraved on stones came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at what? At the face of Moses because of what? Because of the glory of his face. And then he adds, fading as it was, to remind us that the glory of Moses' face is a glory, but it is a fading glory. Okay? Watch this now, how will the ministry of what? The Spirit. Wow. How will the ministry of the Spirit fail to be with even more glory? Isn't that remarkable? For if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. That's the new covenant. For indeed, what had glory, old covenant in this case, has no glory because of the glory of the Spirit, because he's already said that, verse 8, the glory of the new covenant in the Spirit surpasses it. For if that which fades away was with glory, much more that which remains is in glory. And then, to make things even more intense, if we look at verse 17 and 18, as I have up there, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. But we all, here's the Moses theme again, we all with unveiled face. So the face ties us back exegetically to Moses and his face, right? So the play on words is intentional. So we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. It is, in other words, what's he saying here, guys? That the glory that Moses had was fading, and it was less of an accurate representation to the archetypal glory than the glory that we now have in the new covenant by the Spirit. That is more of an exact glory. See that? It's like looking into a mirror. That's how close the correspondence is. You see what I'm saying? So what Moses had under the old covenant was more of a veiled refraction. What we have under the new covenant is more of an exact refraction. You see what I'm saying? We are coming closer to the glory that God wants to reveal in us in the new covenant, showing the new covenant. The whole, you can say, well, what's this whole passage about? New covenant superior to the old covenant. That's it, right? But in order to show us that, we look at two faces. We look at the face of Moses, and we look at the face of believers in the new covenant to show the surpassing glory of the new covenant. And when we look into that mirror, what are we looking at? Beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord. We are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord, the Spirit. So it is the Spirit who gives us this glory, who imparts this beautiful, glorious emanation to this radiance, as it were, right? It begins on the spiritual plane now. In other words, you and I don't care what the Pentecostals say, you and I are not walking around glowing, okay? I don't care what Bethel does to their vents, or, there's no dust floating around us, or, nothing, okay? Sorry. Okay, that sort of visible luminosity awaits us, but the reality is, guys, is that even now, and I think this is where Colossians, if you keep your hand there in Corinthians, so a lot of scripture right now. Colossians chapter 3, verse 3, with our finger back still in Corinthians. You have died, and your life is what? Hidden, watch this now, with Christ. And where is Christ situated? In God. You see that? So the hidden life of the believer in union with Jesus Christ, right? The principle of that life actually finds its environment, its sphere in God. You see what I'm saying? It's really remarkable, because you start thinking about positional justification, and the fact that we are in Christ, right? So now what Paul says, to be in Christ means that really you are in God. You see what I'm saying? Your whole life is now in him. It's really incredible. It's kind of like you are in the divine temple of God before you actually physically get to the temple of God. You see, it's amazing. And so again, to show the connection between the glory, the image, the Spirit, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, this time verses 4 to 6, same reality. The people who have the gospel veiled to them, the God of this world has blinded the minds of these unbelievers so that they may not see what? The light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is himself what? The image of God. So now we're thinking of doxa, right? The Greek word is doxa. There you go. If you guys want some fancy Greek to impress you or something. So if we go from glory, and then that glory is seen by virtue of the Spirit. What is he saying here? He says here, and then what's the next thing he ties it to? He ties it to the image. You see what I'm saying? And so the image of God has everything to do with the glory of the Spirit in the face of believers by virtue of image endowment. What does Adam have in the garden as he's being described there in Ezekiel 28? This is coming full circle now, right? In Ezekiel, all of this precious beauty, this glory, I would say it this way: the glory that Ezekiel's talking about here, I think I can make a case, is the glory of the priest. Because the stones that are mentioned here are part of the ephod of the high priest. And so what Ezekiel's saying is that you were like the high priest in the Garden of Eden, the original sanctuary. And there you were invested with unspeakable beauty, unspeakable glory. It's just a way for him to say you were in a lavish environment of glory and beauty. And what do we find in Genesis, in Eden? What do we find there? Genesis chapter 2, verses 7 and following. What does it say? It says, as Moses is describing Eden, how does he describe it? There's all manner of what there? Precious stones. And in Havilah, which is a place we should all be looking for, there's good gold. Right? I don't know, why are we going after the Ark of the Covenant? We should all be looking for Havilah, you know? So Dylan's like, did I just get that on camera? All the precious stones are there, all the gold is there. And then it says, watch this in verse 14, you were the anointed cherub, we're not going to get into all that, who covers, and I placed you there. Wow, look at that. God placed him there. That's interesting. No, I'm going to resist the temptation. You were where? On the holy mountain of God. You did what? You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. That's interesting. What were the stones of fire? So in Ezekiel's mind, to be on the mountain of God is to be amidst fiery stones. Those same exact Hebrew words, the stones of fire, same exact language of Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah is in the midst of the sanctuary of God, and the angel, the seraphim, takes the stones of fire from the altar of God to put them on the mouth of Isaiah to cleanse him. You see what I'm saying? It's just an image of heavenly glory. And so when Adam was there ascending the mountain of God in Eden, he was surrounded with that which pertains to the heavenly glory of God. That's the imagery. That's what the typology is symbolizing. He was in the sanctuary of God, which is basically, if you go from Eden, right? That's basically what's going on here, is you have heaven, right? And then you have the projection of heaven on earth. That's what's going on. So Eden was, as Kline says, the earthly projection of the heavenly realm. And so what when Adam was here on the mountain of God, it was a symbol, a picture of what it means to be on the mountain of God in heaven, which is Zion ultimately, right? Zion is Harmageddon. Harmageddon is Zion. That's what it's all about. So that's why it's amazing to me how Jesus, when he resurrects, when he has the fullness of the Spirit, when he has full image endowment upon himself, when he is the life-giving Spirit, he's standing on a mountain. And what's the next thing that he does? He goes into heaven from a mountain, right? He does it specifically from a mountain, I think, in order to recreate the imagery, this Edemic, to bring it to its fullest consummation. So we've gone way off base, and that's okay. That's what we do in the Kline group. Any questions about any of that? Because that stuff is heavy, and most people, they're like, I don't know if I believe all that. My wife, I drag my wife into these conversations, late at night. She's like, okay, I kind of see it, I don't know.
I could see how that you might take this to be Satan rather than Adam. I mean, it's confusing. It could go either way, it seems like.
Yeah, the language, I'm like, I can see it both.
One thing that makes me think it's not would be that it says that you were in Eden. I think he says where I created you on the day that you were created. So if you're in Eden when you were created, Satan was created way before that.
Yep.
And that's why I was thinking when you said earlier.
Not only that, whoever this person is, Adam, whoever this person is, when he is in Eden, he's beautiful.
Right.
He's arrayed in glory. He's in a paradisical. He's what does he say here? He even calls him beautiful. He says, "You had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom, perfect in beauty." And so, is that who Satan was in Eden? No. In Eden, he was fallen. In Eden, he's a serpent. He's not beautiful. You see what I'm saying? And he's not full of wisdom that's good wisdom. He's full of deceit. He's a liar from the beginning. So there's a lot to go towards the Adamic position. And so, So that's that's one of the reasons why we have to really, really understand this whole notion of image endowment and why the image of God is so important, and why we have to understand how the Spirit is sort of to be found in the original Edenic pattern, and what man was supposed to be because of all of that. So anyway, it's just a lot there. Let me go back to this and try to finish this up here, if I can even remember where we left off. Oh, yes. Seen from this eschatological telos, see you, brother. God bless you. The Sabbath is thus God's pledge. Oh, this is important. This is, the Sabbath is God's promise or his pledge to bring man to his consummate end as he entered God's rest. Kline sees the idea of divine commitment, which is at the heart of his understanding or his definition of a covenant. And remember, Kline defines a covenant as an oath-bound commitment. That's what a covenant ultimately is. Someone takes an oath, and there are certain commitments that are made, sometimes by two parties, sometimes by one party, etc. And so Kline says, only through this covenant commitment on the part of God would man be brought to his eternal beatitude in the highest heaven. And so for Kline, to be sabbatically structured meant that human existence was from the beginning covenantal as well as eschatological. Kline will elsewhere remind us that though the term covenant, this is very interesting, guys, because you guys will encounter this argument with dispensationalists, with other people who say, well, the word covenant is nowhere. Even New Covenant theology people will tell you this. The word covenant is not found right in the first 3 chapters. But notice that when it does first appear, for example, in Genesis 6:18, God makes a promise to who? To Noah. And then when the covenant is actually stipulated to Noah in Genesis 8 and 9, right? How does that appear? It appears in terms of Eden. What does Kline say here? Here you go, Dylan. The post-diluvian Ordering. That's the word that Dylan did not like, pre-diluvian.
That's one of them.
Yeah, that's right. So the post-diluvian, after the flood, the ordering of the world revealed in the divine disclosures to Noah was in effect a reinstituting of original creation arrangements. And it is designated a covenant. So I think that's a that's a very powerful argument for, if you're the reader of the book of Genesis, you look at what Adam had, and then you see the repetition of that in Noah. Here it is called the covenant, and there you can only assume that's a covenant. That's where he got it from. That's the arrangement comes from that original situation, so it must be covenantal. For Kline, the Sabbath is thoroughly covenantal, and the creation week is a covenant order where the Sabbath is its sign. That's interesting because for Kline, he almost views the creation week as a covenant itself, and the Sabbath is like the sign of that covenant week. It's amazing. I don't know if I go all the way with him there. But it certainly is interesting to think about. Kline is insightful because he elucidates for us the nature of biblical covenants, consisting of where the commitment emphasis lies. Remember, we talked about this before. When, in fact, God alone seems to take the oath, like with the covenant of Noah, or make the commitments, the nature of this covenant is essentially gracious. So when God is by himself making the oath, it is a gracious covenant. But when God requires commitments from his people, the covenant bears a works principle, as with the original covenant with man. This hermeneutic is everywhere in Kline. And so what the Sabbath suggests is that God has committed to bring man to his consummate end. Like God, who works then rests, the Sabbath makes it clear that after man's work is over, he too, and his posterity, should and could arrive at final rest with God. And I give you all the scriptures that we looked at, some of them anyway, about God's rest in the book of Hebrews. Thus, creation itself, isn't it amazing? In the book of Hebrews, all those texts, the word rest is almost substituted for salvation. So you can switch out the word rest, whether it's typological rest in the Old Covenant or actual salvific rest in the New Covenant. It's amazing. I mean, that's how it functions throughout the whole book. So creation itself, and from the outset, has set forth God's covenant interests from the very beginning. That the rest of God and his people is indicative of eschatological rest. The apocalypse sets believer and unbeliever in antithesis. How? Based on their experience of rest or the lack thereof. It's interesting because in Revelation, that's what it says. In one passage, chapter 14, verses 11 to 13, right? We go from those who have no rest to believers who have rest. And that is indicative of where you end up, in heaven or hell, captured by the idea of rest or the lack thereof. For Kline, the Sabbath is the sign and the seal of the covenant of works. That's interesting because some would say the sign of the covenant of works would be the tree of life. But I don't know. I mean, after all this, the Sabbath certainly does represent a sign, and it seals the whole covenant week. So this may receive support from the later Mosaic covenant, where once again, check this out. Once again, right? The Old Covenant, what was the sign of the Old Covenant? Exodus 31, verses 16 to 17. The Old Covenant sign was the Sabbath, right? Which, if you get into the debate on the Sabbath with people, this is an argument they don't like, because they would say, well, you don't observe the Sabbath. Well, what happened to the 10 Commandments then? Is 9 commandments now, not 10? I've had people argue that with me a lot, and I would say, yeah, okay, that's a fine sounding argument. But why is the Sabbath therefore a sign? What happened to the other 9? Are the other 9 not signs? I mean, why is it just this one is a sign? So I would say clearly, even as Kline will teach in this book, that the Sabbath is ceremonial in character not eternally moral in character. In other words, Jesus can break the Sabbath, as it were, and work on the Sabbath because he supersedes the Sabbath. He's the Lord of the Sabbath, right? But try that with any other commandment. Whenever can you take God's name in vain? You can't. Whenever is it okay to lie or to murder? You can't. You see, so the Sabbath has a ceremonial component, and because it's ceremonial, it falls in the category of what's known as positive law. You guys know what that is? Positive law is like a law that God can enforce, but then after it runs its purpose, he can retract it. Okay? It's temporal, it's temporary in some sense, okay? He does that all over the Old Covenant. I mean, you go from circumcision. If you don't get circumcised as a Jewish child, I mean, you're cursed. And then you go to Galatians chapter 5. If you get circumcised in that Galatians context, you are accursed. You see what I'm saying? So obviously, the circumcision falls under positive law, as does the civil and ceremonial laws. The dietary laws were positive law. You'd commit an abomination by eating shrimp. An abomination. But under the new covenant, God tells Peter, kill and eat. You know what I'm saying? What happened to the morality of that law? Well, it was positive law. So I think that the Sabbath kind of falls in principle through that. Anyway, we'll get to the Sabbath controversy enough later, but just a little bit more here, guys. Because now we move to this covenant proposal of Sabbath grant. And here, Kline, let's take our books. Kline is actually going to deviate. I think what Kline's interest is here in going to this is not only, again, to show us that this is all part of God's architectonic plan, okay, but then after that, he's going to suggest the justice system that is involved in the covenant and why you cannot deny the covenant and why you must have works, judgment, rest, and why that work must be meritorious and why that rest cannot be given by grace to Adam, for example, okay, under the covenant of works. Look at what he says there, page 62. He says, the divine architect builder of the cosmic house engages in an assessment of his work and registers his satisfaction. What has been produced corresponds perfectly with his architectonic plan. As expressed in Proverbs 8, wow, that's interesting, that version of the creation week, the divine wisdom takes delight day by day in the progress of the cosmic structure. In this scrutiny of his works of creation and the pronouncing of his approbation, meaning he approves of it, we see the God of the heavenly throne sitting in judgment on his own work. The archetypal sabbatical pattern is then one of work, judgment, and rest. As the divine architect builder, God reveals himself as the Alpha creator who creates with a purpose. I'm still reading my notes. Creates with a purpose from the very outset of his creative fiats. So again, from the very beginning, as he creates with a purpose. Everything that he does it not just does he do it well, but he does it for a purpose. I think that's so important. The Sabbath reminds us that God is also Omega, and thus God is likewise the Sabbath-attaining creator. So he kind of shows man, you must obtain the Sabbath. Like you had to attain to the Sabbath, and you don't reach your end until you get to the Sabbath goal. You see? Through image endowment, the creature is likewise set in motion toward Sabbath consummation. In fact, Sabbath consummation is congruent with image consummation, for both have their final goal as eschatological glory, or the final goal is eschatological glory through the glory spirit in the glory realm, and these texts that we've given here. That's a lot. That's a lot. Let's just say that there's two more parts here, and that is the creator and creature distinction and the creator-creature relation. Because for Kline, he wants to show the qualities of the justice system that is contained in the covenant of works. And so let's see if we can get to this a little bit. He says, from this all-important point, a great distinction lies before us in theology, namely that whatever is to be gained in the creator and creature relationship must not be lost in the creator-creature distinction, specifically when it comes to God's ontological qualities. What I mean there is ontic qualities. What inheres, what is inherent for God, cannot and will not ever inhere in the creature. God has all wisdom, righteousness, holiness within himself. In other words, the reason why I'm talking about all of this is because there's a difference between God's work, judgment, rest, right? And man's work, judgment, rest. When God's approbation is rendered, he doesn't merit anything, he doesn't gain anything. It's not for any sort of approval that way, right? Because everything that is inherently good of God is not good of man. Man does not have inherently what God has. Okay, God has all of this lying within himself, and this is the key. Thus, all authority, dominion, right are immutably God's by nature. That's the key. By contrast, these qualities, that's the whole reason we have a Genesis probation. These qualities are possible. They are proleptic in man. They are conditional. Man's nature itself is what? Mutable. That's the difference. And so, while the divine sabbatical pattern teaches us much about the nature of man's covenant obligations, it is not a perfect mirror. Like much of man's earthly life, an analogy is found that will always be like God only, and never univocal to God completely. Okay, so that's important, because as much as Adam is like God in attaining Sabbath rest, the ontological distinction has to be maintained. But there is a creator and creature relation. Nevertheless, a relation still exists between God and man, and that one is real. Through work, judgment, and rest, through that pattern, for God, even though that was non-meritorious to God, non-ethical, non-probationary, it is for man, by virtue of his relation to God as the great king of all the realm of Eden. And here we get into a little covenant theology. As the vassal, Adam must render obedience to the great suzerain king, the great king of heaven. That's his situation. I don't even know what I wrote here. That is situation that ensues in the original creator. That's the situation. Sorry, that is the situation. I'm writing these notes so fast, trying to get them off to Jenny before I forget. Thus, Kline speaks of Adam's performance in his probation and his meritorious service to the Creator. Kline also speaks of the angels as having passed through this probation crisis. Wow. That's usually a thought that nobody thinks about. The angels also were in a state of probation. And so Scripture speaks of the elect angels, right? In Timothy, right? Where's that? 1 Timothy. I remember when I first discovered the elect angels, kind of blew my mind a little bit. I thought my Calvinism was over. And then in come the elect angels of all things, right? Where's that at? Chapter 5, 1 Timothy chapter 5. Or is it 2 Timothy? Real quick. Or 2. Oh, yes.
1 Timothy 5:20.
Is it 5? What does it say? Oh, yeah, there we go. I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Jesus Christ and Christ Jesus and his chosen angels to maintain these principles without bias. It's kind of remarkable, right? Because we never want to maintain that Satan was the ultimate cause behind the fall of Satan. This still puts the emphasis on the sovereignty of God. Right? So You thought you were a Calvinist until you got to this point. You thought you understood the sovereignty of God up to this point, right? Like, God is that sovereign. He is sovereign even over the fall of Satan and the demons that went with him.
I have a question about
Yeah.
that. Since some of the angels fell, obviously Satan, when he fell, wasn't like the federal head of all of angels like Adam was, but why wouldn't that affect all the angels like it affects all humans? Because they have a different charge? Or?
Well, when it comes to the fall of Satan and the angels that went with him, it's very mysterious. So we're given very little data on that, you know. But no, I don't think they did not fall with Satan as a representative head. I think the position is that Satan must have deceived or seduced those angels to fall along with him. Not that when he fell, they, you know, some sort of demonic imputation or something. You know what I mean? But that they made their choice as well. They aligned themselves with the evil one, you know, the anti-Lord, as it were. You know, made their own choice, you know. But still amazing, all within the rubric of God's sovereignty. And so they failed the test. They fell from heaven like Adam falls from Eden, the mountain of God. And so so what is the point that Kline mentions here? Here's the point. Let me summarize it for you this way, guys. At the very end, page 64, he says, unfortunately, there in the middle, there are currently not a few revisionists who deviate from these tenets of traditional covenant theology. And there, some people would say he's going back here as far as the Reformation to talk about throughout the history of the church and throughout the history of theology that there have been those that rejected the notion of a covenant of works, okay? And so maybe even going all the way back to the Westminster Assembly or something like that. Some people have suggested that. But I was thinking of anyone who basically deviates from traditional theology in our time, it would be New Covenant theology, okay? Because New Covenant theology maintains kind of what he's talking about here, that Adam can never earn anything from God, right? That heaven is so high, so good, the reward is so infinite that there's no way the creature could ever merit that. You see what I'm saying? It's too unattainable. Even through he can render infinite obedience and not get infinite heaven. That's the kind of logic they want to go down the line. What Kline is saying here is that the problem is that it touches on the very distinction between the law and the gospel, and he says inevitably it can lead to a Judaizing subversion of the gospel. Why does he say that? Why do you think he says that? It's confusing. But I have a quick fix. Why is he concerned that if you deny the covenant of works, you could inevitably end up a Judaizing gospel? What was the Judaizing gospel?
You get circumcision.
What's that?
Circumcision.
Yeah, but what was the principle? What was the principle behind that? Circumcision was being wielded in what way?
As works-based salvation.
As works-based salvation? Was it all works-based? Huh?
A blend.
A blend of the two, right? That really is, if you study Galatians, and especially if you study like the background of Galatians, you read a commentary on it, what they're saying is that the Judaizers are saying, yeah, in the new covenant, grace and the gospel does get you this far, but you need works to get all the way. To be
Catholic Church.
To be fully acceptable before God, what are they saying? You need a mixture of the two. And so what Kline is saying is, if you deny the justice system of the covenant of works, you're mingling works and grace. And so if it can be mixed with Adam, perhaps it can be mixed with us. If the two principles of works and grace are synergistic, then maybe they're synergistic with us too. But the book of Romans says absolutely not. You cannot mix the two, right? It's either works or grace, right? And the reason why it has to be by grace is so that it accords with faith. Or he says it the opposite. The faith so that it accords with grace. Because in Romans, he already says works or the law is not of faith. That's interesting, right? So what is he saying there? What he's saying there is that what the law demands is not faith. The law demands obedience. It demands Galatians chapter 3. You have to do it all, right? The person who is going to obey the law, you have to keep the whole law. You see what I'm saying? So it's showing you right there that there is no mixture of the two. And so if you deny the justice system of the covenant of works, you're in trouble already. And that can set you down a trajectory covenantally where you end up at a place you don't want to end up. And so it's best to absolutely hold to the idea that by his works, Adam was going to be justified and glorified before God. What's the other problem with that? If we mess up what Adam did, what does that have ramifications for as well? Or who does that have ramifications for?
He says it turns the cross of Christ into ultimate act of judicial malfeasance.
Yes, that's right. It touches the work of Christ. And that's very important because Romans chapter 5, verse 14 explicitly tells us that Jesus is a type of Christ. Or that Jesus is a type of Adam, or Adam was a type of Christ, rather, right? And so the typology between Adam and Christ is broken at that point. And so you cannot maintain for Adam 1 what you deny for Adam 2. You cannot maintain for Adam 2 what you deny for Adam 1. If Jesus earned our justification, then Adam must have also been in the same arrangement as the type, right? So type and antitype. So they both had to be under the same justice system. That's the only way that the typology works. So that's it. A little bit more, but I won't go into it here because we're woefully out of time. That was a lot. I feel like I did a lot of reading. Good on you guys for enduring and persevering through all that. Any other questions, brother?
Sure, awesome.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you can too. Let me end this broadcast for anybody still watching the video. There are a few people watching out there. God bless you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Tune in next time for the Kline Group.